They said the ship was already dead. Flames tore through 6 decks. Bombs exploded one after another. Rockets shot across the flight deck without anyone pulling a trigger. Thick black smoke swallowed entire compartments, trapping hundreds of sailors in darkness. The U.S. Navy had a rule for disasters like this. When the boilers are lost, when the engines are silent, when fire reaches the ammunition, you save who you can. Then you abandon the ship. But on the morning of March 19, 1945, one officer looked at a burning aircraft carrier and decided the Navy was wrong. He wasn't an admiral. He wasn't a famous engineer. He wasn't even supposed to be the man history would remember. Yet the decision he made over the next few hours would save hundreds of lives, earn America's highest military honor, and change how the U.S. Navy teaches sailors to fight for a dying ship. But before he could save the ship, he first had to survive it. Just after 7 a.m., the aircraft carrier USS Franklin cruised only 50 miles off the Japanese mainland, closer to enemy airfields than almost any American fleet carrier had dared to operate during the war. The crew believed the worst was behind them. Their aircraft had already launched strikes against Japan. Breakfast lines stretched through the mess decks. Pilots prepared for another mission. Mechanics fueled an armed aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip across the flight deck. Then a single Japanese dive bomber slipped through the clouds. Nobody saw it until it was too late. 2 550-pound bombs punched through Franklin's wooden flight deck before exploding deep inside the hangar. The first blast ignited aviation fuel. The second reached fully armed aircraft. Within seconds, the carrier became a floating volcano. 31 loaded aircraft erupted into flames. Thousands of gallons of gasoline exploded. Bombs, rockets, and ammunition began detonating in every direction. Men were thrown overboard. Others vanished beneath collapsing steel. Hundreds more found themselves trapped below deck as smoke filled every passageway. Then came the worst discovery of all. The explosions had killed the ship itself. The engines were silent. The boilers were dead. Without steam, there would be no pumps to fight the fires. No power. No escape. Only a drifting, burning carrier surrounded by enemy waters. And deep inside that floating inferno, one officer was about to walk toward the fire instead of away from it. From a distance, USS Franklin looked like a volcano drifting across the Pacific. Columns of black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the sky. Explosions echoed every few seconds as rockets and ammunition cooked off beneath the twisted flight deck. Escorting ships could only watch, expecting the carrier to disappear beneath the waves at any moment. But what they could see wasn't even the worst of it. Below deck, the battle had become a nightmare. Smoke poured through passageways so thick that sailors couldn't see their own hands. Bulkheads glowed with heat. Twisted steel blocked escape routes that crews had memorized during countless drills. Every explosion above shook the ship below, collapsing ladders and tearing open new fires. Nearly 300 sailors found themselves trapped inside a darkened mess compartment. Some began saying goodbye. Others searched desperately for exits that no longer existed. Every breath burned their lungs, and every passing minute stole what little oxygen remained. Above them, damage control teams fought a battle that seemed impossible to win. Hoses had gone silent. Electricity had failed across large sections of the ship. The explosions had crippled Franklin's steam system, the beating heart of every Essex-class carrier. Without steam, nothing worked. The pumps couldn't move water. The elevators couldn't carry ammunition. The fire mains lost pressure. Even the massive propellers beneath the ship stood completely still. Franklin wasn't simply burning. She was helpless. Naval doctrine was brutally clear. A carrier without propulsion, surrounded by fuel fires and unstable ammunition, was no longer a warship. It was a floating bomb. The priority became saving survivors, not saving the ship. Nearby vessels prepared to receive hundreds of exhausted sailors. Many officers believed Franklin would either sink on her own or have to be scuttled before the enemy finished the job. No one could blame them. Nothing in the Navy's training suggested a carrier could recover from damage this catastrophic. But deep inside the burning hull, one officer saw something everyone else had missed. He wasn't looking at the flames. He was looking at the silent boilers. Because if he could bring back just one, the engines might turn again, the pumps could come alive, and the fires consuming Franklin might finally have an enemy. It sounded impossible. The men who knew those boiler rooms best had already abandoned them. Some believed anyone who went back inside wouldn't come out alive. Donald Garris listened to every warning. Then he started walking toward the boiler room. Everyone thought Garris's next decision would kill him. Instead, it became one of the greatest damage control stories in naval history. Donald Garris wasn't supposed to be the man who saved an aircraft carrier. He didn't graduate from the Naval Academy. He never wore the polished reputation that followed many young officers. In fact, for most of his career, he wasn't an officer at all. He had started at the bottom. In 1919, a teenage Donald Garris enlisted in the U.S. Navy as an ordinary seaman. While others studied engineering in classrooms, Garris learned inside the engine rooms of real warships, covered in grease, surrounded by steam pipes, and listening to machinery that could kill a careless sailor in seconds. For nearly 24 years, he climbed the ranks, one promotion at a time. Fireman, machinist's mate, chief petty officer. He became the kind of sailor who could hear a boiler and tell if something was wrong before a gauge ever moved. Only in 1943, after nearly a quarter century of enlisted service, did the Navy finally commission him as an officer. To some Academy graduates, he was just another Mustang and officer who had come up through the enlisted ranks instead of earning his commission through Annapolis. But on USS Franklin, experience mattered more than prestige. And nobody knew the ship's engineering spaces better than Donald Garris. When the bombs exploded that morning, Garris wasn't standing on the bridge. He was already below deck. The blasts instantly plunged the compartment into darkness. The lights failed. Smoke rushed through shattered passageways. Sailors stumbled into walls, calling out names they could no longer see. Within moments, panic spread faster than the fire itself. Most men would have searched for the nearest exit. Garris did something different. He stopped. He listened. Somewhere beyond the smoke, he remembered an emergency route running through the ship's maze, like interior a route almost no one else would think to use. Feeling his way along twisted bulkheads, he found it. One by one, frightened sailors followed his voice through the darkness until they finally reached fresh air. For many, the nightmare was over. For Garris, it was only beginning. Instead of escaping with the others, he turned back toward the smoke. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times he re-entered the burning compartment, guiding more trapped sailors to safety with each trip. By the time he emerged for the last time, hundreds of lives had been saved. Most men would have collapsed from exhaustion. Donald Garris looked deeper into the burning ship, because he knew something almost no one else aboard understood. Saving the crew meant nothing if the ship itself couldn't survive, and to save the ship, he would have to enter the one place every Navy manual said to abandon. The boiler rooms were now hot enough to kill a man within minutes. Garris was about to walk inside anyway, and what happened there would decide whether USS Franklin lived or died. The hatch to the boiler room stood open. Beyond it waited darkness. Heat rolled out like a blast furnace, carrying thick smoke that stung the eyes before a man even stepped inside. Somewhere overhead, another explosion shook the ship. Steel groaned. Dust drifted from the ceiling. No one knew what would explode next. Every instinct told the engineers to stay out. Naval damage control doctrine existed for a reason. When a fire room became flooded with smoke, crippled by explosions, and surrounded by burning aviation fuel, crews were ordered to evacuate. Boilers could be replaced. People couldn't. The Navy wasn't asking anyone to relight those boilers. It was preparing to lose the ship. Donald Garris had other plans. He gathered a handful of exhausted engineman men who had already survived one evacuation that morning. Their faces were black with soot, their uniforms were soaked with sweat, some were coughing so hard they could barely speak. Garris didn't promise they would survive. He simply said they still had a chance to save the ship. Then, he stepped through the hatch first. Inside, visibility was almost gone. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Water pooled across the deck plates. The temperature climbed high enough to drain a man's strength within minutes. Every valve they reached was scorching hot. Every movement demanded absolute concentration. One mistake could release superheated steam powerful enough to kill instantly. Above them, bombs and rockets continued exploding. Each blast rattled the machinery they were trying to bring back to life. The safest decision would have been to walk away. Instead, Garris began rebuilding the ship's heartbeat. Working almost entirely from memory, he directed his men from valve to valve, checking damaged gauges, opening steam lines, and preparing boiler No. 5 for ignition. Nothing happened. The first attempt failed. Then another explosion rocked the carrier. Someone shouted that the fires were getting closer. Another sailor urged Garris to leave before they were trapped. He refused. Again they adjusted valves. Again they checked fuel pressure. Again they tried. Then a faint vibration traveled through the steel beneath their boots. One gauge twitched. Then another. A thin whistle echoed through the compartment. Steam, for the first time since the bombs had struck, the dead machinery answered. It wasn't enough to save Franklin. Not yet. But somewhere else aboard the carrier, engineers watched needles begin to rise. The impossible was becoming possible. And when word reached the bridge that one boiler was alive again, Captain Leslie Garris faced the biggest decision of the entire battle. Because bringing a single boiler back to life was one thing. Betting the survival of an entire aircraft carrier on it was something else entirely. One boiler was running, but Franklin was still burning, still drifting toward enemy waters, and still carrying enough explosives to destroy herself. The captain now had to decide whether to trust Donald Garris or abandon the ship forever. As steam pressure slowly climbed, the mood aboard USS Franklin began to change, not because the fires were out. They weren't. Not because the danger had passed. It hadn't. The carrier was still burning from bow to stern. Explosions continued ripping through the shattered flight deck. Thick smoke still poured from the hangar, visible for miles across the inland sea. But for the first time that morning, the ship wasn't completely helpless. News spread quickly through the surviving crew. One boiler was alive. Deep inside the engine spaces, Donald Garris and his men had done what almost everyone believed was impossible. Now the question wasn't whether the boiler worked. It was whether anyone dared trust it. On the bridge, Captain Leslie Garris faced an impossible choice. He could order the remaining crew to abandon the carrier and wait for escorting ships to rescue whoever was left. Or he could gamble hundreds of lives on a damaged steam plant that had only just begun to breathe again. If the boilers failed, Franklin would drift defenseless within striking distance of Japanese airfields. If another major explosion reached the engineering spaces, every man below could be killed instantly. No Navy manual offered guidance for a disaster like this. Every decision now rested on human judgment. Garris made his choice. The order went out. Keep fighting for the ship. Below deck, Garris' engineering teams refused to let the pressure fall. Hour after hour, they monitored valves, repaired damaged lines, and coaxed more life from the battered machinery. Around them, damage control crews dragged hoses through smoke-filled compartments, flooding burning ammunition lockers before they could explode. Elsewhere aboard Franklin, sailors trapped in the shattered steering compartment continued working in almost total darkness, keeping the damaged rudder under manual control despite being cut off for nearly 17 hours. Nobody aboard knew if the carrier would survive the night. They only knew giving up meant certain defeat. Slowly, painfully, the steam gauges continued rising. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The massive turbines finally answered. Far below the waterline, Franklin's propellers began turning once again. At first, almost too slowly to notice, then faster. The dead carrier started moving under her own power. Cheers echoed through compartments that only hours earlier had been filled with smoke and despair. Franklin wasn't safe. Not even close. She was still badly damaged, still burning, still carrying hundreds of wounded sailors. But she was no longer waiting to die. She was fighting her way home. Yet Donald Garris' greatest reward wasn't a medal. It was something far more meaningful. Hundreds of men who had expected to die that morning were now watching the Japanese coastline slowly disappear behind them. And only after the danger had passed would the world learn just how close the U.S. Navy had come to losing one of its greatest warships. More than 700 Americans had already lost their lives. But because Franklin stayed afloat, hundreds more would live. The final chapter of her journey would transform one desperate act of courage into a permanent lesson for the U.S. Navy. By the morning of March 20th, 1945, USS Franklin was still afloat. That fact alone seemed impossible. Just 24 hours earlier, experienced officers had believed the carrier was beyond saving. Fires had consumed her flight deck. Explosions had torn through her hangar. More than 700 Americans had been killed, making Franklin one of the deadliest disasters ever survived by an American warship. Yet somehow, she was still moving. Slowly, escorted by other ships, Franklin steamed away from Japan under her own power. Every mile carried her farther from enemy aircraft. Every mile proved Donald Garris had been right. The restored steam plant kept vital pumps running, allowing damage control teams to contain fires that otherwise might have reached untouched magazines. Engineers worked around the clock to keep the battered machinery alive, knowing a single major failure could still doom the ship. For days, exhausted sailors refused to stop. They slept wherever they collapsed. They ate when they could. Then they returned to work. Franklin eventually reached Ulithi Atoll, where emergency repairs kept her seaworthy. From there, she sailed to Pearl Harbor before making the astonishing journey across the Pacific to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Nearly 12,000 miles after the attack, the carrier that had been written off as lost entered port under her own power. It was one of the greatest survival stories in naval history. But for Donald Garris, recognition wasn't immediate. He never claimed to have saved the ship alone. He knew hundreds of sailors had fought beside him, damage control teams, engineers, medical personnel, pilots, and deck crews. Franklin survived because ordinary men refused to quit when every reason to quit stood right in front of them. Months later, President Harry S. Truman presented Donald Garris with the Medal of Honor. His citation praised his repeated rescue of trapped sailors and his extraordinary leadership in restoring the carrier's engineering plant during one of the worst naval disasters of World War II. Garris later retired from the Navy with the rank of commander, a promotion earned in recognition of his wartime service. He never became a household name. He never sought fame, but the Navy never forgot. Even today, the story of USS Franklin remains one of the service's greatest damage control case studies, a reminder that ships are saved not only by armor, weapons, or technology, but by the courage and determination of the people inside them. Donald Garris didn't invent a revolutionary machine. He didn't command a fleet. He simply refused to leave when everyone else believed the battle was over. Sometimes, history changes because one ordinary person decides that impossible isn't good enough. If this story surprised you, you're only scratching the surface of the forgotten heroes of World War II. There are countless moments where ordinary sailors, soldiers, and airmen changed history with decisions no one expected. Click the next video in this playlist to discover another unbelievable true story, one that history almost forgot but deserves to be remembered. Because sometimes, the greatest victories weren't won by the most famous heroes. They were won by the ones history nearly left behind.